How's MidCamp so far? Great, great. Well, I wasn't able to make it yesterday, but I'm really happy to be here today with some amazing people, and I see a lot of people in the audience who I've seen before. This is Decoupled Drupal in the front end. I'm going to go ahead and warn you, this is a beginner's session, so if you're interested in the nuances of REST APIs in Drupal, or let's say deep into the React component API, please come to me afterwards and we'll talk more about those sorts of things. One thing I will say is that I'm going to talk about sort of decoupled Drupal as a whole, and delve just a little bit into sort of the implications, and we can maybe have some discussion at the end as well. And one thing I will say is if you have a laptop and you have and you want to follow along, I will be doing a sort of brief demo slash live kind of coding thing. So if you do want to get going early with that, I highly recommend you download Acquia Dev Desktop, which is an AMP stack that you can use. And also, I highly recommend that you get Postman as well, which is an API, a REST client to test REST APIs. You can go to getpostman.com. You can get it as a Chrome extension or as a desktop app. I'm going to be using the desktop app, and we'll sort of go from there. So let me just go ahead and get started. Welcome, and my name is prestonso. I work at Acquia. I've been in the Drupal community since 2007, 2008, starting with Drupal 5. I'm currently development manager of Acquia Labs at Acquia, which is our new R&D initiative. And I was also very involved in the Colorado community way back in the day when I was still living in Colorado. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And my Twitter handle is prestonso, as well as my GitHub and my Drupal.org username. So here's what we'll cover today. I want to talk briefly about what decoupled Drupal is. Why you would consider decoupling Drupal in the first place, what are some of the implications of doing that, how do you get started with decoupled Drupal, what are some of the things that you need to do to set up Drupal to be a RESTful backend for your client-side applications. Fourth, I'll talk a little bit just briefly about integration with clients. I'm not going to delve too deeply into specific client-side applications just because that's beyond the scope of this, and if you do want to hear more about that, please feel free to come to me afterwards and we'll talk. And then finally, I want to end with a bit of sort of interesting ideas about the future of the front end and maybe have a bit of a discussion since we have a lot of people in the room who are eager to have that discussion. So the first thing I want to talk about is the history of content management and the sort of momentum that we're seeing in the last couple of years toward microservices. First of all, before I get started, I just want to get a sense, how many people here are front-end developers? Like JavaScript, like people who are doing MB star frameworks? Okay, what about Drupal front-end developers? Twig, PHP template, Smarty, Xtemplate? No, I was kidding. Okay, cool. And what about just back-end Drupal developers who are interested in REST APIs and that kind of like web services and core? Okay, great, awesome. We have a great spread of people here. So I'll sort of give each part equal consideration instead of focusing on one. Okay, so let me just start off with a bit of a history background. So back in Web 1.0, let's call this the early 90s, mid-90s, when the web was just getting started as something that people were actually thinking about. The New York Times had just started its website. Back in those days, you really didn't have what we consider now as a CMS. The server housed a bunch of flat assets, and basically the client would display those assets. And you would just use an FTP client to just upload those files up, and those flat assets would be what would be displayed in the browser. So you would have images or HTML files. And this is where sort of the job title of webmaster really came from. If you can modify HTML and you can modify, and use an FTP client, then you have a job in the pre.com bubble days. So that all changed, however, with the introduction of sort of this idea of Web 2.0. And in Web 2.0, what really changed is basically we have an introduction of what's called a CMS, a content management system, which we're all familiar with. And in this case, what would happen is you would have a database, namely a MySQL database in Drupal's case, which would serve data to a CMS, written in PHP, such as Drupal or other server-side languages. And this data would travel through a template engine. In Drupal 8's case, that would be Twig. In Drupal 7, that was PHP template. And this template engine would go ahead and do a bunch of string concatenation and pre-processing of this information to put the data into a nice rendered output of markup. And this rendered, let's say, HTML markup would then be sent out to the client. And this is really the model that a lot of CMSs followed back in the day. If you think about things like movable type or early CMSs that used this approach, that was very much what was happening in those days. And this was really in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s to mid 2000s. Now, in the early to mid 2000s, we had a big shift in how the web really worked from an application standpoint. And this really came about because of the phenomenon of AJAX, or asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which is kind of a misnomer these days. But basically the whole premise is, rather than limiting all of your server-side templating and all of your markup building to the server side, you would actually have some dynamic injection of new data dynamically brought in from the server side. And this would be done using the XML HTTP request approach in JavaScript. And basically, your JavaScript within your client-side markup would fire a request, retrieve some data, inject that data back into the DOM, the document object model. And so what happens is, the AJAX response would come back, and you would have sort of this, approximation of what an application is. And if you think about applications such as Gmail or Google Maps, sort of in those early days of the mid 2000s when they were still a thing, they were sort of just getting started as real applications. Most of those interactions took place via AJAX. So, sort of what ended up happening is you had more and more applications using more and more AJAX on the page, and more of the page getting taken over by AJAX requests. And this can be kind of scary because, for example, if you've used the Views UI and you do very quick operations in quick succession, you'll find that you run into race conditions where sometimes an AJAX request will fire. You do this, you get some problematic conditions where a response might not have come back when you fire a new request, and then you get some errors, and so on and so forth. So now in the last, I would say, about 4 or 5 years, we've really evolved to what I would call Web 3.0. And the whole idea of Web 3.0 is, rather than use AJAX requests that are very sort of granular, let's go ahead and use a RESTful API that serves as a middleware layer between the server CMS, the server-side CMS, and the client-side. And we find this model, especially today, when you have, for example, a JavaScript MV star framework, model view anything framework, which will basically make these XML HTTP requests, but will actually use a RESTful API that serves not sort of markup, or not these sort of not just mounds of markup, but actually JSON payloads. And the difference here is that JSON is a very good data format for serving data that you can then traverse easily and put into your page in a way that's really manageable. And basically, so JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, by the way. Just for those of you who aren't familiar,
that happens.
That happens. It'll come back. Okay, good. For those of you who aren't familiar with REST, REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's a term promulgated by Roy Fielding in his PhD dissertation in 1996 about this whole idea of using HTTP methods as a data transfer protocol. That's more granular than, let's just say, HTML, right? I'm really oversimplifying that. There's a lot more to REST than I just said. But right now, what I want to be very clear about is that I'm talking about typical RESTful architectures that you find today, not necessarily REST as in pure REST. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. So what would happen is you would make an HTTP request from the client, you would issue a request, and the server will issue a response in response to that request. And this data can then be used by the client-side application framework, let's say, or any sort of application framework that you're using to go ahead and fill in the blanks where you need them. And so what's really nice about this whole Web 3.0 approach is that you can have a single REST API shared across multiple client-side applications. So for example, you can have a native mobile application, a single-page application built in JavaScript. You can have, let's say, a desktop application that uses REST as its protocol, and then, HTTP as its protocol. Or you could even have an Internet of Things application. You can have your Nest thermostat call Drupal, or you can have your refrigerator or your car make these requests. So the sort of evolution of web architectures is changing a lot these days. And one of the things that I want to mention is the history of content management has always been about monoliths. You'll hear, we are not a monolith. Well, we are a monolith. Content management systems, on the whole, have really historically been monolithic, in that you have a single end-to-end CMS that basically gives you your entire feature set. It's soup to nuts, which means that everything from your database retrieval and your interaction with the database and your database abstraction layer, let's say, all the way out to the rendering of markup, all takes place within a single monolithic CMS. And this, in Drupal's case, happens entirely on the server side. So this includes server-side templating. So if you imagine things like Twig or PHP template, all of these template engines that we have encountered in Drupal are things that are used exclusively on the server side until recently. So just to be very clear, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a full-featured CMS, and in this case I'm using Drupal 6 as an example because Drupal 6 is not typically one that you would use as a RESTful service. And the front end, or the theme layer as we colloquially call it in Drupal, is something that lies within this monolith and is not something that you can very easily decouple from the CMS. Now, the big problem with this is that, as Josh Koenig and Amitai Burstein have said, the boundary between the theme layer and the functional layer in Drupal is highly permeable, in that Drupalisms leak to the front end. There's leaky abstractions. So how many people here have themed a view before? I'm sure many. How many people have enjoyed theming a view before? Part of the reason views are so interesting is that when you have your markup that's generated by views, you'll have this mess of classes, which can be views, view row, view field, and it gets to be basically, if you're someone who's never used Drupal before and you're asked to style these classes, let's say, you as a CSS expert, or as a CSS purist rather, like I am, will sort of balk at these class names and say, why are all these Drupalisms in the front end? I don't really need this stuff. And so lately, with the sort of evolution of Drupal 8, we've seen a lot of work to clean up a lot of that markup. This was the case in Drupal 7, where you really had a lot of those leaky abstractions. And thanks to a lot of people who are actually sitting in this room, we have a lot of really great markup in Drupal 8. One thing I do want to mention is in the sort of late 2000s, Henry Bergius, who now works for thegrid.io, came up with this idea of a decoupled CMS in the context of Drupal. Now, this is sort of the predecessor of the sort of current idea of decoupled Drupal, and I want to be very clear that Henry Bergius's idea of decoupled Drupal stems from this philosophy of service-oriented architecture. Namely that you have a collection of tools that you use that form a cohesive whole, but they merely communicate via APIs. And so, for example, in this case, you have a front end, which is templates and CSS, which is generated by the web editing tool, in this case, create.js, and a web framework underlying behind that, which is, in this case, Drupal. And then underlying that, you would have a content repository, which would basically serve data to Drupal. Now, this was sort of a short-lived kind of approach, and you don't really hear about Create.js too often anymore. But if you remember back in the early days of sort of, especially sort of in the late 2000s, this was a very big idea. And lately, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've gotten to this point where a lot of people are concerned with microservices, namely independent encapsulated functional components. And in these days, especially nowadays with the growth of Node.js and the really sort of proliferation of microservices in our industry, you're seeing this idea where people are saying, do one thing and do it well. I don't want to have an entire monolith powering everything across. I want to have something that maybe renders, but I don't want that to control my user permissions, right? Or I want one thing that controls my authentication, namely an authentication microservice, but I don't want that same microservice to control things like layout building, for example. So with that in mind, I think that's a good enough background for me to delve into the definition of what decoupled Drupal is, or headless Drupal, as you might have heard in the last couple of years. Simply put, decoupled Drupal is the use of Drupal as a data provider by means of a RESTful API. Now, this definition might shift a little bit because RESTful APIs are sort of the most common way to decouple Drupal as of this moment. However, there are sort of other ways to do it as well, and I'll talk briefly about, for example, GraphQL at the very end. And namely, the real scintillating factor here is that the front end and back end interact solely via RESTful API, which means that the front end and back end are communicating via JSON payloads, JSON response and request payloads back and forth. Now, the whole philosophy of microservices is predicated on this idea that you design, not microservices, but this whole idea of an API-first methodology is predicated on designing your API first, let's say within Drupal, or using Drupal's out-of-the-box RESTful API in core, and then writing your client-side application based on that RESTful API. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So there's sort of two approaches that have gained a bit of steam lately in the Drupal community and sort of the wider Drupal ecosystem. The first is what Dries Buytaert calls fully decoupled Drupal, which is Drupal serves solely as a JSON API in this case, because we're mostly using JSON, which serves data payloads to other applications, right? So a client-side framework, which is often shared isomorphically between client and server, and I'll talk a little bit more about what isomorphism actually is, controls all the rendering. And that means that basically, Drupal no longer serves the front end, right? Drupal is no longer responsible for the front end. Basically, as Mark Ferry at Chapter 3 called it, you're essentially decapitating Drupal. You no longer have the ability to use Twig. You no longer have the ability to use pre-process functions. You no longer have the ability to use template files. All of that is now passed over to your client-side framework, right? Now, there's back in September or October, Dries published a blog post about this idea of progressively decoupled Drupal, which really aims to resolve some of these problems of, maybe some people do actually want some of the Drupal front end. Maybe some people actually do want to be able to do things like layout management in Drupal. In this case, Drupal controls some of the render process to provide the markup within a single unified application. And in this case, you have a JavaScript framework, or let's say native JavaScript that you've written, which actually lies on top of Drupal and does further rendering on the client side. So that's a very sort of baseline definition. And basically, the comparison that I want to build here is that rather than sort of Henry Bergis' model of decoupled content management, what we have now is we have our backend, which is Drupal, and it's a Drupal RESTful API, and Drupal's basically all of the things that we know and love about Drupal on the backend, and then on the front end you replace essentially the Drupal front end with something like AngularJS or Ember or React, and so on and so forth. Now, the main reason that people are so interested in decoupling Drupal is because of the fact that you can use a single Drupal installation to power multiple client-side applications. And this is a very compelling idea, because if you have a single unified RESTful API which serves data to a whole bunch of different applications, you only have to worry about that data in one single place, right? So separation of concerns becomes a lot easier, and there's a whole lot of stuff that a lot of people consider easier. But from the Drupal standpoint, a lot of stuff becomes harder. So in this case, we can have a client-side framework, an application built in the client-side framework, such as an Angular application. We can have a native mobile application, which is, for example, an iOS application built in Objective-C. Or we can have other clients, namely Internet of Things applications, or let's say set-top box applications like your Roku or your Samsung TV. All sorts of applications now are able to ingest data from Drupal. So one note, there's sort of an interesting debate in Drupal about the nomenclature of this. A lot of people, just like the whole idea of isomorphic JavaScript is under a lot of controversy. Basically, what is headless Drupal exactly, and what is decoupled Drupal? Well, they're the same thing. But the strict definition of headless software is software capable of working on a device without a GUI. And yes, decoupled Drupal does fit this bill, but we also have already an example of headless Drupal that we use on a daily basis, namely Drush, which is our CLI. And so, I prefer the term decoupled Drupal, even though it sort of has the connotation of service-oriented, because of the fact that headless Drupal is very unclear. Where is the neck? Where does the head end and where does the body start? Right? It's like playing a game, where it's like it's like playing Surgeon or something. I don't know. So. Now let me talk a little bit about motivating decoupled Drupal, because this is, I think, where a lot of people have in the past gone wrong with decoupled approaches to Drupal. And I want to first talk about this idea of separation of concerns. So, one of the big reasons why people are decoupling Drupal is because you might have a team that's made up of a lot of JavaScript developers, right, who don't know PHP, who don't necessarily understand the sort of finer details of Drupal's theme layer, and namely things like the render array system. And as a result, they may not want to, for example, use the Drupal theme layer. And so one of the things that may come into play is your JavaScript team may say, look, we want to decouple Drupal's front end and use our own front end system in order to make our lives easier and make our developer experience easier. That's fair. Now, the other sort of interesting concern here is structure versus presentation. A lot of people have determined or have sort of this opinion that by decoupling Drupal, by decapitating Drupal, so to speak, you are allowing Drupal to control solely the structure of your data, namely the data, your content model, and all of the things that are involved in that, and also your and split that from your presentation layer, which is dedicated to, let's say, a JavaScript framework. This sort of, and so this idea of separation of concerns comes into play here in that your structure is completely distinct from your presentation. And JSON, as we know, is a data format that provides you the ability to serve structured data. Also, there's the idea of model view controller, which is coming into play quite a bit in the JavaScript community, especially with the ongoing JavaScript renaissance. This idea is very compelling. Namely, you have a model, which is your data layer. You have a controller. Excuse me. You have a controller which basically is triggered by the view and influences the model, and vice versa, right? So the controller serves as the layer between your model, which is your data, and your view, which is your presentational layer. Now, the final reason why people might want to do decoupled Drupal is, as I said earlier, if you have a single unified place where you're storing your data and you're writing, and you've got your data built. You can write once and you can publish everywhere. This idea of content syndication, right, where you have your JSON data being sent out to your client-side application over here, your IoT application here, your native mobile application over here. Now, okay, so is it all fun? Is it all good? I mean, well, there's a lot of problems with decoupled Drupal. There's a lot of weaknesses. And what I will say is that I strongly caution you when you decouple Drupal, if you decide to fully decouple Drupal, according to the term I used earlier, I strongly caution you because you are going to lose a lot of the robustness of Drupal. You are going to jettison a lot of the things that make Drupal really great. And you're going to have to do a lot of things to resolve that in the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about some cases that I'll leave anonymous shortly here. What are some of the things that you lose with Drupal? Well, the first thing is you lose a lot of security. Drupal has a dedicated security team. We have a very secure CMS, and you lose that capability. Oftentimes you'll have to build your own authentication system within your client-side application. You'll have to resolve stuff like cross-origin requests and figure out how you're going to manage those. Drupal has built-in form validation, which you'll have to rebuild yourself in the client-side application. And this is a bit less of a concern nowadays with JavaScript isomorphism, but search engine optimization becomes an issue because if you're doing a lot of rendering on the client side, that is not going to be necessarily registered by Google. Although Google did recently announce that they are executing JavaScript to get all of the sort of text that could possibly appear on the page. What are some other problems? Well, first of all, content workflow and management. Right. Let's say that you want to be able to provide, a means for you to unpublish content or moderate content. How does that work in a decoupled setting? Oftentimes you're going to have to really cater your RESTful API to allow those sorts of things to happen in your client-side application, which may not be as desirable because Drupal already has that built in. If you use a module like Workbench, that's all built in for you and that's all done. You don't have to really set up anything else. Now, probably the most important concern that I will say for sort of your clients and sort of people who might be interested in pursuing a decoupled Drupal implementation is layout and display management, namely things like panels and display suite. What are you going to do if your client requests a change in the sidebar width? Well, if you are writing your application in JavaScript, or let's say you're writing an iOS application, you're going to have to get your developer in the room with that person to make that change for you. Drupal makes that easier because Drupal has this philosophy of making the assembled web possible, right? So if you have panels, you can drag around your panes, you can resize them, and that all happens within Drupal. So that's sort of a very, very big problem that's a very big feature that you lose in Drupal. And you have to be very careful about that. Multilingual and localization. So Drupal in the front end has a method Drupal.t, which is our sort of our native localization system on the client side. Now, if you're, for example, using a JavaScript application framework such as Angular or Ember, these frameworks tend to have their own approaches to multilingual and may not. There's going to be some friction between their multilingual approach and Drupal's. So you have to be very careful about that and think about how that influences your localization, your approach to localizing Drupal. Now, finally, last but not least, two very important considerations. First, accessibility and user experience. Accessibility. Drupal has, the Drupal community has worked very, very hard to make sure that Drupal is an accessible system that can be used by anybody. If you're using a screen reader or some other assistive technology to use Drupal, Drupal makes that easier for you with ARIA roles and all sorts of accessibility features that are built into Drupal. If you decouple Drupal and you build your own front end, you have to rebuild accessible markup yourself. You have to consider accessibility on your own. And finally, user experience, right? Drupal has, we have thought a lot about UX in the Drupal community, and we have done a lot of work in terms of UX. And you have to build your UX from scratch. You have to rethink your UIs or really consider how you're gonna how your users are gonna interact with your front end. So one of the things that I will say is that I believe that a lot of the momentum that's gone toward the JavaScript renaissance and these JavaScript frameworks is very dangerous, because I'm worried that we're entering another Wild West period. Similar to the browser wars and sort of the problems of table-based layouts and box model hacks back in those days. I'm worried that we're re-entering that period because we're having a lot of people who are not considering accessibility and markup and sort of this idea of standardized markup in terms of building their applications. One thing that you'll notice, for example, in React is because JSX, for instance, requires a surrounding div around every single rendered component, right? You get this possible condition of divitis, where you just have a whole colossal collection of divs, and a lot of people don't understand that a lot of that markup is stuff that you can do away with and is not actually semantic. And so that's a very important consideration that I want to highlight, is that if you're going to decouple Drupal, you have to basically become the markup guru. You have to become the purist, and you have to make sure that your markup and all of your work you're doing on the front end is accessible and is semantic and is good markup. And so that's the risk you're going to have to take. What are some benefits, though, of decoupled Drupal from the project management or team side? Well, one of the things that often happens when you decouple Drupal is that your team decouples as well. You have two distinct teams that are diversified, and now you have teams that can work at two different velocities. So you can have one team that's upgrading Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and you can have one team that's working solely on, let's say, the Angular front end. You no longer have this sort of this blocker where your backend developers are upgrading from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, and now your front-end developers also have to sort of upgrade their minds from PHP template to Twig. That could be one consideration. It's a minor one, but it is important to consider. And one thing that you'll find a lot these days, especially in the enterprise, is that a lot of these multidisciplinary teams who are working both in the Drupal backend and also in these decoupled front ends, is that you have a lot of front-end developers who don't have any Drupal knowledge at all. And one of the things that has happened in Drupal 8, especially with the Twig initiative, is to make this easier for people who are new to Drupal, who don't understand necessarily how the Drupal front end works. However, a lot of people simply don't want simply want to use handlebars or simply want to use some other kind of templating system that is desirable in JavaScript. Now, the other consideration is that front-end redesigns can become easier because if you need to revamp your entire front end, it could be a lot easier for you to do that in Angular than it is in Drupal. And that's possible. It's arguable, obviously, but it is possible. All right, so when should you decouple Drupal? Well, you should only decouple Drupal if you're talking about a central Drupal content repository. I use site kind of loosely here. What I mean is Drupal as a central site that contains content as this sort of content reservoir, right? This is a site that can power one or more other sites. It can be a site that powers one or more other applications, a site powering multiple things. I strongly caution you, and I definitely do not advise decoupling Drupal if you're going to build something that's standalone. And I've seen this happen a lot with, for example, Acquia's own customers, where people are saying, well, we have this standalone implementation that we want to build with Drupal. Should we decouple? The answer is absolutely not, because that doesn't make sense. The whole reason people are decoupling Drupal is to allow Drupal to serve a variety of applications, not just one. If you're going to just serve one, why not just use Drupal? All right. Any questions so far about sort of the philosophical aspects of Drupal and that kind of stuff? Okay. All right, so let me go ahead and move forward into how you actually get started with decoupled Drupal. This is actually the actual kind of hands-on part of the presentation. So if you're interested in decoupling Drupal 6 or Drupal 7, off the shelf, neither of those versions of Drupal actually has an opinionated REST layer. And there is the services module in Drupal 7, and there is an upcoming version of services in Drupal 8. Built-in REST XML RPC interfaces. You have all of your content entities being served, and Services entity, for example, extends services to work with all entity types. Now, the one thing I will say about services is that services is not strictly RESTful. it doesn't really follow necessarily the strict RESTful paradigms that you find in Roy Fielding's dissertation, for example. But honestly, where's the guy who's using REST correctly, anyways? Because there's not a whole lot of people who are actually doing REST properly these days. One exception, however, is our core REST system in Drupal 8. There's some alternative modules that you can use with Drupal 7, namely REST-WS, which will expose any Drupal entity on its path based on headers. RESTful is more entity-centric, but you can cater the data and the payload that actually goes back in terms of the response. So there are options if you have a Drupal 7 site right now and you want to explore decoupling Drupal 7 right now, you can do that with these options here. Okay, what about Drupal 8? Well, early in the Drupal 8 lifecycle, we had a new initiative started that was led by Larry Garfield, or Krell in the Drupal community, called the Web Services and Context Core Initiative, or WSCI. And no, I'm not talking about alcohol here, but it incorporated web services into Drupal 8 core. And the core REST layer in Drupal 8 is very what should I say? Very loyal, let's say, to RESTful principles as laid out by Roy Fielding in terms of the whole concept of resources and so on and so forth. Now, web services allows for all content entities to be exposed as JSON and HAL, and also views now natively supports a REST export as a new display type, and this display type will merely yield a JSON version of your view. And I'll show you this what this looks like very shortly. So one thing is that I want to note is there are many issues with REST in core right now. Namely, there's a lot of traction right now to bring in support for configuration entities, config entities, and other sorts of features in REST in core. I highly encourage you to check out, if you're interested in contributing or sprinting on this, there's a whole tag, RX, REST experience, not a prescription, not medicine, a REST experience on Drupal.org. That's very active. Now, in terms of your actual core modules, these are already available if you install Drupal out of the box. And these 4 modules are sort of the core REST modules that you want to use in Drupal. All right, so there's another module I do want to mention, which is Relaxed Web Services, which is an alternative to REST and core. It's a contrib module, and Relaxed extends the core REST API to include things like revisions and file attachments. And one of the most compelling aspects of Relaxed is that, let's say you have your Drupal site spread across your dev, stage, and prod environments because you're using a proper DevOps setup. Well, the problem is that oftentimes, the entity IDs that you have on each environment do not match up. And so what Relaxed does is it provides you a mechanism to have cross-environment UIDs that are shared across everything. So let's say you have a node that's node ID 1 in your dev, node ID 5 in your stage, and node ID 265 in your prod. If you use Relaxed Web Services, there's you can basically unify those and keep them in sync. Also, Relaxed is part of this overarching suite of modules that is pointing toward content staging and offline first applications, which are way out of the scope of this talk. But one thing I do want to note is that it uses an existing API specification standard, namely the CouchDB API. And that is one thing that core REST in Drupal 8 does not have. We do not currently follow any sort of canonical standard of API spec design in terms of REST. Or in terms of a JSON API. If you need that sort of standardization, if you're working with other applications, let's say that are using the CouchDB API spec, this might be a good option for you. Okay, so one thing that I do want to note now is you can set up RESTful Drupal right now in this room, and I'll show you right now how to set this up. You can set up a Drupal 8 site through Acquia Dev Desktop. It's a free download, and I just realized I have to log into the Wi-Fi to do this, so I'll do that shortly. It's a free download. It's a very painless way to set up a Drupal 8 site. You can check to make sure it's working locally. For example, if you use MidCamp as your name, as your domain, you can do that. And also, Drush is the fastest way to quickly download and install dependencies. Okay, so let me go ahead and just go through these steps briefly, and I'll do them actually for you right now as well. So if you want to go ahead and follow along. Now that you have a working site, you need to set up some dependencies. These modules are already available within Drupal core in terms of Drupal 8. So if you want to enable those core modules to get REST set up, you can do so right away. HAL, basic auth, serialization, and REST. Now, there's 2 ways to configure your RESTful API, your core RESTful API. Now, just a quick note, I'm going to be using the core REST server in this talk because it's the quickest way to get started. I don't, if you want to talk about services and that kind of thing, this is just focused on the core REST web services. So there's two ways to set up your REST configuration in Drupal. The first is you can use rest.settings.yaml if you're into YAML. I like YAML a lot, but I'm also a very visual person and I like to have a UI to work with. Or you can also use Swampy's REST UI module, which is a very powerful solution as well. It just merely provides a UI that writes basically YAML to that file. Now, one thing to note, if you're new to Drupal in this room, one thing to note is that anytime you save configuration across your site, you want to make sure to clear your caches. And in Drupal 8, that command has changed from drushcc_all to drushcr, which stands for cache rebuild. Okay, now let's. One thing I want to do is to very quickly get going and get some content. You can generate some content and get some really quick filler content put into Drupal, and this, for example, will generate 20 nodes of filler text into your Drupal site. Alrighty, so let me just go ahead and show you what this looks like right now, and let me get connected to. I'm sorry about this. This is a mess on my screen right now. Okay, 1 second. I should have done this before I got here. Okay, so
MidCamp
Drupal 8, right?
Yes.
All right, thanks, Mark. Cool. Alrighty, so here's how you get set up with Drupal 8 really quickly. So let me close this out. You can add a new Drupal site, getting the Drupal distributions list. I want to install Drupal 8, and I want to call it MidCamp, right? And we can give it a dedicated directory here. We can finish, and what it'll do is it'll download your Drupal distro, this distro of Drupal 8, namely Drupal 8. And then basically what we now have is if we navigate to the site, we now have our nice installation screen. And I will just go through this really quickly here so we can get moving. But basically, this is just literally from the beginning. When you start from scratch, how do you set up your Drupal site to be RESTful? And so we'll go ahead and set up our database. We've got MySQL going here as well. Installing Drupal. Now, one thing I do want to do while this is going is I want to introduce you very quickly to the tool we're going to use as our REST testing client. And I realize this is very small. Postman, which is a very powerful tool to test your APIs. And the reason I'm going to use Postman is because I don't really have enough time to delve into the nuances of how to do this in Angular, Ember, React. We're going to focus just on Postman because, generally speaking, if you're using Drupal as a JSON API, this is how you're going to use, this is how your clients are going to integrate with Drupal anyways, using HTTP methods. All right, so let's go ahead and check on our progress here. And Postman is available at getpostman.com, by the way, if you're so inclined, and you can actually use that as an HTTP client for anything. If you want to just fire GET requests against different paths and get back pure HTML, that's totally fine as well. It's kind of like curl or wget. All right, so let's just really quickly set this up. Yes, Drupal, I know it's a weak password. I'm sorry. I know I'm breaking a lot of laws.
Admin.
Oh, whoops, I did not do this correctly here. Okay. Yes, admin is so anytime you want to hack into my site. Is it still not? Nope, it's good. I think it's, oh, whoops. Sorry, thank you. Did that? Okay, all right, there we go. Can everybody see okay, by the way? Is this too small? Can I zoom in? Okay, good. All right, so now that we've got this set up, what I want to do is you can just get Drush going right here very easily. And basically what we want to do is we want to make sure Drush exists.
Can you make that bigger?
Yes, absolutely. So we know Drush exists. Now the next thing you want to do is want to enable those modules that we were talking about, right? So how, basic auth, serialization, and REST. Oh, whoa! There we go. All right, so this is a strange bug in Drush that I haven't quite been able to figure out. But Alrighty, so the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and download REST UI. And we want to enable it as well. And what I'll show you is, and this was built by Huampi at Lullabot, which is just a really, really easy to use tool. If you don't want to edit rest.settings.yaml, you can go ahead and set this up this way. If you go down to REST, and these are our content entities here. And as you can see, we've got our 4 main HTTP methods here. And I go ahead and edit. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to check all of these because, just to make things easier as we're testing. You don't want to do this in production, though, most likely. Probably not the best idea. So I save configuration. I make sure to clear my cache. And the next thing that we'll do is, if I go back and I remember what I was doing. Oh yeah, okay. So next thing we'll do is we'll get some, some dummy content going. So I'll go ahead and download Devel. I'll go ahead and enable Devel, and I'll also enable Devel Generate. And now we can use basically the alias command in Drush to basically just generate some content. And so what I'll do is I'll really quickly show you right now that our content view, our default content view is, oops, sorry, I clicked the wrong link there. Our default content view is empty. There's no content available right now. So if I go ahead and do gen c20, this will create for me 20 different nodes that are just full of filler text. And if I refresh the page, you'll see that I now have a bunch of filler content. And if I go into one of these, for example, you'll see that I have just some Latin text in there. OK, so now that we've talked about that, let's go back to our slides here. And let's talk about testing with Postman. Well, that's really disruptive. Alrighty, so the next thing to talk about is Postman. As I talked about, Postman is an HTTP client, which allows you to test your API very easily. In this case, I'm using the desktop app. And this is how a typical HTTP request payload looks, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to perform a GET request against Drupal's REST API for node/1. And what I'm going to do is I already actually got this set up from when I gave this demo previously in New Jersey. I have a site already set up here, which I'm going to go ahead and use. And it has all of my content here. And if I go into Postman, what you'll find is that I've got requests already set up here. Now, the one thing to note is that if you don't have GET permissible for any anonymous user, you're going to have to use an authentication token. In this case, I'm going to use basic auth. You can go ahead and update the request to reflect that token. And now if I go to my headers, you can see I've got my token in there as well. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and trigger this request. And as you can see, when I issue this request, what I get back is a nice JSON payload, response payload, which contains all of the information about my node, right? So here's the title, which is in Latin. I've got basically my body here, which currently says, "Yay, we are decoupling Drupal," because I did this already. So that particular content is located.
Node 1?
Yes, node 1. So that's, well, yes, node 1. Yay, we are decoupling Drupal. And as you can see, I've just gotten a GET through that. All right, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a new node. Okay, so same idea. You want to use your authentication token if you don't have that available for anonymous users. I mean, I highly recommend you don't allow anonymous users to just create content willy-nilly on your site. But you can if you want to. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give Drupal some information about what we want to say. Okay, so for example, I'm going to clear this out and call this MidCamp 2016. And one thing I want to note also is that if we go back to the content page, there's currently no content called MidCamp, right? There's nothing there referring to MidCamp at all. And if I go back here and I say MidCamp 2016 rocks and is the best, and then let me just go ahead and put some Latin text in here. Lorem ipsum, dolores et amet consectator, adipissing, you get the idea. Then I go ahead and send this request, and what you'll notice is I get this really nice HTTP status code, 201 created. And if I go back and I refresh the page, Shazambo! Now I have my MidCamp 2016 rocks and is the best node created. Now, as you noticed, I never went to add content, or I never went to any sort of Drupal page to do this. I did this solely through my HTTP client, and I basically made a post request that created a node in Drupal, and now we're good to go. All right, so let's take this particular node ID here, node 29, and let's talk about how we're going to actually go ahead and update it, because I don't like this title. I think it doesn't reflect the awesomeness of MidCamp enough. So I'm going to go ahead and do another request, which is a patch. And instead of node 29, node 28, I'm going to make this node 29. Now, what's a good title? Let's say MidCamp is
Super awesome.
super awesome. Okay, and then I'll change this to say Chicago, Illinois, for an exceptional conference about Drupal. Alrighty, so now if I go ahead and make this request, and one thing I'll show you is the header again. We've got our authentication token in there as well. One thing I'll do now is I'll go ahead and send. And, whoops. Let's see here. All right. Forgot to change it up here. All right, live demos. All right, so I hit send now. Now I got the paths matching up. And now I get this 204 no content, which is actually a good thing, because when I go back and I refresh again, our title now says MidCamp is super awesome, and I go into that link, and you can see that it says developers descended on Chicago, Illinois for an exceptional conference about Drupal. In short, we have administered Drupal, we have added content to Drupal, we have updated content to Drupal, and we have created, we have read, and we have updated content in Drupal without touching Drupal at all. That's pretty awesome. All right, so just to really quickly go through the rest of these sort of Postman-related slides here. How much time do I have? Do I have 13 minutes or 3?
13 minutes.
13 minutes, okay. So this is how, once again, I'm going to show you just really quickly how these request payloads actually look, because Postman does a very good job of extracting away all the lines of that. You can actually see what these bodies look like within Postman, but I didn't do that. And you can see we got our authentication token, we got all of our headers, and this is what a post looks like, right? And this is what our request body looks like in order to make this article be created on the Drupal site. Similarly, we have our patch request, which has these headers, and then has a request payload that looks like that. And we saw this already in Postman. Okay, cool. Now, what about integrating with clients? Well, so one of the things to keep in mind here is that you need to allow your application to have access to your backend, and that's kind of a problem because usually, very often, you will have your application hosted in a different place from your Drupal site. As a result, you need to resolve cross-origin request security, and the way to do that, you can either use Apache 2, or you can use the handy-dandy course module created by Lullabot also, which provides a UI admin/config/services/course. And one thing to remember: don't forget to clear your cache after you do that. And let me just show you really quickly what this looks like on a typical Drupal site. So if I go over here and I expand this out, I go to configuration in this Drupal Camp New Jersey site that I created previously. You'll see we have another configuration screen here, and if I zoom in, you'll see we've got basically what this is saying is access any internal path from this domain. In this case, my application, which is a React application, and I can actually show you this if you guys really want to see it. I have a React application that I've built for a previous presentation for this very purpose. You can see this actually in action. Why don't I do that actually? That's not a bad idea. Let me just go to here. Let's do. So what I'm doing here is I'm booting up my Express server, which is going to provide for my React application. Now I've got my my local host here, and if I go to localhost 3003 and I go to /nodes, you can see that it's performing a request to node/1, and basically the only way I was able to make this work is by using by using that course UI or changing around the cross-origin request security settings. So in this case, we've got a React application and we're getting data. So okay, that's it for the demos for right now. One thing I do want to talk about now is what do these client-side applications actually look like? Well, the first is, because we're running out of time, I won't discuss these in detail, but Angular, Ember, and React are three different client-side frameworks that you can use, JavaScript frameworks that you can use. All three of them currently work on both the server side and the client side. Namely, they can be executed on both the server side and the client side, meaning that you can have, for example, Ember render out a server-side rendered HTML output, which is then served to your client, and then have Ember take over again on the client side, rehydrate. This is a term in JavaScript. Well, it's actually a Java term. But rehydration in this case means that you're taking what could be stale data, stale markup, and reinserting, let's say, dynamically retrieved markup into it. So Ember on the client side can then take that over and do all the the nifty application interaction stuff that Ember developers love. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, there's this term called isomorphic JavaScript, which involves the ability to share code across client and server. You can use Ember or React or Angular on both the client and server. There's a lot of controversy about this name. Basically, people have argued for the use of universal or shared. Once again, as we know, one of the two hardest problems in computer science is naming things, and we're going to argue about that for years and years and years. But what tends to happen in an isomorphic JavaScript setting is that you use Node.js as your backend, and you also use, for example, if you're using Angular, you might use what's called a mean stack, which involves MongoDB as your database, Express as your routing layer, and your server, your actual server framework that lies on top of Node.js, AngularJS, and of course Node.js. So, while some frameworks do have an actual REST client contained within, so Angular, for example, has a REST client that you can use. There's a whole API that's involved. Others make no such prescription. React, for example, is very unopinionated about the stack, and so React really makes no assumptions about what REST client you're going to use. You can use jQuery Ajax if you want to. However, if you're going to just use jQuery Ajax just for the Ajax, it's not a good reason to use jQuery. So there's two other options, Fetch and SuperAgent. I like SuperAgent because it's a very lightweight API and is really nice. It's very, very kind of easy to read. It's very readable. Fetch also has a polyfill for for browsers that might not be able to support some of those things. And SuperAgent actually is also used by WordPress Calypso to do all their REST calls and their HTTP calls. Alrighty. Now, what about native mobile applications? Well, so this landscape is a bit interesting because there's several SDKs available to build your native mobile applications that rely on a Drupal backend. There's the iOS SDK, Drupal Cloud, which I actually haven't looked at it recently, but it doesn't seem to be available for Drupal 8 right now. There's also other there's also another module you can use, some other modules you can use to make this easier for native mobile applications, like services views and views data source. But this is kind of getting out of scope. Basically, if you're building a native mobile application, you most likely have your own sort of bespoke client, REST client that that you will use. Alrighty, so with that in mind, let me just dive right into the future of the front end. I want to talk briefly about two approaches that have been emerging in the wild to sort of offset some of the big weaknesses of fully decoupling Drupal, decapitating Drupal. The first is Drupal-aware full decoupling. If you're interested in what this method looks like, check out the RESTful panels module. That's d.o/project/RESTful_panels. What they're doing is basically you have a panels layout that you build in your Drupal site. And RESTful panels will integrate with the RESTful API you have, and with the core REST layer, and actually serve out JSON that contains panels configuration information. And so what happens is, if you want to have the ability to resize a sidebar and have that reflected in your client-side application, you can do that. However, there's a big disadvantage. And the first is that you're basically duplicating functionality. You have both your panels configuration that's actually serving a real panels layout within your Drupal site, but that's invisible. No one sees that. That's only visible to your administrators. And then you have your other sort of panels building going on in your, let's say, React application. Because what's actually happening here is your React application on the server side, most likely, is going to go and traverse that JSON payload, get the panels configuration, and build the layout itself. And it's like, Drupal already builds the layout for you. Why would you do that? And the other big problem of this is that JSON was never meant as a data, JSON was never, JSON was never meant as a data format for both data and presentation. The reason you use JSON is to serve data, not to serve presentational information. And so one of the big weaknesses, for example, is that you'll notice that that they actually serve out as part of the payload names of panes. And if you have a pane called top right, what does that mean in a responsive setting, right? When you are using a narrow viewport. Also, there's this idea of potential circular dependencies. If you have a React application where you can also resize the sidebar, and you have also your panels UI in Drupal where you can also resize the sidebar, then you have this problem of circular dependencies. You can get race conditions, and it's just a huge mess. I call this kind of latter approach pseudo decoupling because you're really not, basically you're relying on Drupal to give you information that you still have to rebuild yourself on the front end, which is problematic. There's another approach which is used by weather.com currently on their live site in production. Progressive decoupling is basically this idea of Drupal constructing the initial page structure. And in this case, what weather.com does as part of their presentation framework is that they build their page structure in panels, and they have their panel panes. And each Angular component is tightly scoped to that pane, which means that your site builder can continue to resize the layout, and your Angular developers can build their Angular application, but it's limited to that panel pane. It maintains Drupal functionality like layout and display management, and could be a good idea. There's some really other cool examples of this. First is Miles Blackwood's POC Drupal React Blocks, which sort of interpolates the React application into the Drupal block system. And also Matt Davis's Media Current is building this kind of sandbox module called Decoupled Blocks, which is a framework-agnostic way to achieve progressive decoupling. So it's very, very interesting stuff. So one thing I want to do now is I want to open it up for a discussion in the last three. I'll stay extra if you guys would like. Is Drupal at risk? And I want to say, is the Drupal front end at risk, rather? Josh Koenig, is one of the proponents of decoupling Drupal, in a lot of use cases that he thinks is appropriate. By decoupling Drupal, we can make Drupal a weapon of choice for the emerging front-end development community. I would not call it emerging, but we can become good partners with them in open source. It'll take us into new markets. It'll take us into new use cases. That's an interesting quote. Interested to see what people think about that. And some food for thought. Should you use Drupal with a JavaScript framework to power your admin interfaces? Should you use Drupal with a framework to allow front-end developers to create rich UIs within your site themes? Should you allow them to build these sort of single-page application-like components, or let's say even larger scope things within your existing site theme? And then finally, the question that I have asked and is should Drupal potentially adopt one into core? So if you're interested in more information, I gave a presentation just earlier this week called Decoupled Drupal with React, which delves a little bit more into the React side of things and contains a lot of this same information. That URL currently does not work because I'm still doing some corrections on the slides, but that will be live at the end of the weekend. And then, of course, there's an Acme webinar that I gave with Sebastian Simpson last week, who is the creator of the GraphQL module, which is a very interesting approach to, let's say, protocol-agnostic data fetching and data mutations using Drupal and decoupling Drupal as well. So please feel free to check both of those out. I will have those top slides available at the end of the weekend. And with that, thank you very much. I appreciate it.